Hi, everyone. My name is Leonard Richardson. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a software developer at the New York Public Library, where I work on ebook lending. I'm also a science fiction author with 2 novels published by Candlemark and Gleam. Constellation Games, a first contact story, which plays a major role in what I'm about to talk to you about, and Situation Normal, a military SF satire, which is coming out in December. The purpose of this talk is to let you in on a fun little secret. A lot of people know this secret subconsciously, but we don't talk very much about it. The secret is there are very specific rules around the names of video games and computer games. These rules leave a lot of room for individual creativity, but over the past 60 years, we have followed these rules with amazing fidelity without ever writing them down. English has a lot of implicit rules, like the order of adjectives, but I don't think these rules are dictated by anything about the English language. They seem to have more to do with facts about the way computerized games are played and sold. Rather than a content warning, I am giving this talk a form warning. There is a lot of text on these slides. I'm not going to read it all. I'm not expecting you to read it all. I want to illustrate my points with a lot of examples, and I want to try to include a lot of games that you've heard of. I've published these slides on my website at crummy.com, so you can follow along or come back later at your leisure. Also, I want to say I'm only covering the names of games where the names are in English. I suspect that other languages have similar rhetoric around how you name games, but I don't actually know. So my journey into this fascinating realm started back in 2008 when I wrote a science fiction short story called Mallory about 1980s arcade games. It's free to read online. You can look it up. For the story, I made up 6 fictional arcade games. I couldn't use real games because I wanted to tell a story about the programmers and the companies that created the games. Now, in retrospect, these 6 names aren't the most realistic, but they're okay. The real problem is it took me a really long time to brainstorm just 6 names, 2 of which are kind of similar. This is because I didn't understand the rules for naming games. I didn't even know there were rules, and it took forever to come up with this. Now, a year later, in 2009, I started writing my first novel, Constellation Games. This is a first contact novel about video games, and I ended up having to come up with 33 names along the same lines as the 6 in Mallory. This is all 33 of them. My favorite of these is probably Frosting Frenzy. Now, for this novel, I had to come up with an entire alternate history of video and computer games. I had to name not only 80s arcade games, but 90s mascot platformers, mobile games, that's Frosting Frenzy, handheld games for kids, first-person shooter franchises, computer RPGs, obscure Japanese shmups. And in many cases, the novel doesn't spend a lot of time explaining the game to the reader. It would get boring. The name of the game by itself is supposed to convey more or less what the game is like and what's a real world game that is similar. I remember this feeling from real games when I was a kid at the video rental store in the 1980s. I'd often have to choose a game to take home with very little to go on other than a cool sounding name. But wait, it gets worse. Those 33 games are just the fictional video games made by humans. Constellation Games is a first contact story that includes many different species of space aliens, and it turns out all those space aliens have been making computer games for hundreds of millions of years. So I had to come up with a lot of computer games made by aliens with totally different cultures from human cultures. The names of these games had to feel different. Human sounding names would just sound like games made by humans. There's no way I could do this one game at a time. I had to figure out the patterns, the reasons why human beings name games the way they do. And then I had to break the patterns so that I could make games with different names that tell stories about alien cultures. As far as I can tell, no one had ever looked into this. There were lists online of best names and worst names, but there were no written rules, even subjective ones, about what makes a name good or bad. So what do game titles do? How do we even know if a game title was good or bad? I saw the worst games names list online, and a lot of those games names seemed really good to me. So I've attempted to answer this question in the form of a Venn diagram. On the left, we have real games. Real game titles are designed to make people want to play the game. The game developer wants money, or even if it's a freeware game, they want people's attention. They want people to play. So a title is a little tiny ad for the game. On the right, we have fictional games. For fictional games, the title basically stands in for the entire game. I can come up with an interesting name. I can maybe drop a few mentions of mechanics into the story, and I give the impression of a fleshed out game without having to design the whole thing. Just like I can drop a few details about a character, give them a little bit of dialogue, and I don't have to, create a whole real person behind it. Now, letting the title of the game stand in for the game as a whole is really good for me, but it turns out I'm not very good at game design. In the middle, we have the work that game titles do, whether they're actually real games behind them or whether it's a fictional game. And one big one is the title has to communicate the experience of play. The name needs to explain how the player will feel while they're playing. And this is where game titles have a different job from the titles of books or movies. And the last one, common between real and fictional games, is that a game title has something to say about the culture that created the game. For real games, this is just something that happens. We create a game, we give it a title, and because we're embedded in our own culture, that title probably inadvertently reflects something about the culture that we live in. And this means we can look back into history. We can look at the titles of real games to see how human cultures have changed over the past 60 years as computerized games were invented and then as they became more and more common. And for fictional games, you can run the engine in the other direction. A title is a crystallized piece of world building. It's a little window into the fictional culture that created the game. This is the core insight that made it possible for me to write Constellation games. The titles of the fictional games tell the readers something about what the creators of the games are or were like. Now let's see how this shook out in the real world with real game titles. As you can see, for about the first 25 years of computerized games, game titles were very simple. Almost without exception, the name of the game was the name of a real-world activity, usually a sport or a non-computerized game, though I did toss in one of my favorite game titles from the 1970s, Watergate Caper, which was a safe-cracking game. In all these cases, the title is basically saying the same thing. It's that thing you like, but now a computer is involved. Sometimes the word computer is literally in the name of the game, like with computer space, computer tennis, or computer baseball. It's basically getting people used to the idea that a computer is a thing you can play a game on. Of course, there's a huge problem with this. In the 1970s, as video games become big business, and as replaceable cartridges allow third parties to publish games that are compatible with someone else's hardware, the problem becomes obvious. For about 15 years, every baseball game, computer game released was called baseball or a slight variant of baseball. But not everyone can call their baseball game baseball. By 1980, that name has been taken, and we have to get more creative about the names of our games. Otherwise, we can't get a trademark on the name of the game. Consumers will get confused and buy a competitor's baseball game instead of our baseball game. Of course, in a society with a different relationship to commerce or to computers, there's no reason why you couldn't have hundreds of games with the same name. This wouldn't look like a problem in a different culture. So these secret facts I'm revealing about the titles of games aren't necessarily universal truths. They stem from facts about a few human cultures. But here in our timeline, after it became clear that different games needed to have different names, we ended up with two basic attitudes towards how to give a game a title. The first attitude is that computer games are works of art, like novels or movies or rock albums or oil paintings. So you should name a computer game using the rules that apply to works of art. The second idea is that computer games are products. They get packaged, they get put on a shelf, real or virtual, next to competing products, and they're sold directly to consumers. So they should be given names that are distinctive, catchy, and trademarkable. These ideas are in tension, but they're not really in competition because even the artiest computer games usually get put on a virtual shelf and sold like laundry detergent. So the best game titles, at least from our culture, I think convey the game's dual identity as a work of art and as a commercial product. But how do you actually pick a title? You won't get very far just thinking of titles without any plan. Well, here's the most common strategy for picking a title. And this is a strategy that I think is unique to the medium of games. Imagine you're playing a computerized game. What are the moving parts? I've helpfully diagrammed what I think of the moving parts here. There's you, the player, over on the left, and you're using some kind of human-computer interface to manipulate the game state over in the lower right. You can't experience the game state directly because it's just a bunch of bits in a computer memory, but the computer's hooked up to some kind of display that conveys part of the game state in a way that your senses can perceive. I'm being as general as possible here because I had to take the same framework and apply it to games designed by space aliens with different sensory apparatus and different ways of manipulating computers. But you can see that the player state display triangle creates a feedback loop. You manipulate your game controller, that changes the game state, that changes what's displayed on the screen, and that changes what goes on in your mind so that you then complete the feedback loop by making another move, shifting your finger on the game controller, hitting a button or whatever. Now, the single most common game naming strategy is to come up with a name that explains what it's like to be inside this feedback loop. For this reason, and this is the fundamental rule of game naming, game titles are written in the second person and the present tense. That is to say, you are doing this, as opposed to I did this, first person past tense, or she will do this, third person future tense. The second person part is because you, the player, are essential to completing the feedback loop. And the present tense is because the game as a feedback loop only exists while you're playing it. Now, this is really unusual. More generally, second person is almost never used in literature. Austin Grossman wrote a novel called You, and as soon as I saw the title, I knew it was about computer games. If you've ever played interactive fiction, you've seen one of the only written media where the second person is common. Now, this inside the feedback loop naming strategy is very common with games that fall on the commerce side that are meant to be sold by like laundry detergent rather than the art side, games that are meant to be works of art. And that's because this is a hard sell. It's literally telling the potential buyer what experience they're buying when they buy the game. They're buying the experience of being inside this feedback loop, doing whatever. So to make this a little less abstract, now that we have this tool in our toolkit, let's go back to our baseball problem. Calling our video game baseball does a great job of conveying what it's like inside this feedback loop. It's like baseball. Unfortunately, that's not an option because baseball has been taken 10 times over. So instead, we can use the literary device of synecdoche. We can let part of something stand in for the whole. We can take some aspect of baseball, home run, ballpark, relief pitcher, pennant race, season ticket, and we can let it stand in for the whole sport. All the names on this slide convey, hey, if you play this game, you're playing baseball without the game having to actually be called baseball. Synecdoche is incredibly common in the names of games. You just have to pick a phrase that captures the essence of being inside that feedback loop. And here are a couple ways of doing this that I found looking at a bunch of game titles. So a lot of games are named after the player character. Some common examples, or at least the ones that spring to my mind, Ms. Pac-Man, Mega Man, Sonic the Hedgehog. There's a lot of these. This reminds me of 19th century novels, which often shared a name with a main character. Jane Eyre, Dracula, Frankenstein, etc. The difference is that 19th century novels are either third or first person. This is my story. I'm Jane Eyre. This is my story. Video games are second person. You are Bayonetta, and this is the story of you as Bayonetta or Duke Nukem or Mega Man. Not to put too fine a point on it, but if there was a video game called Jane Eyre, the background assumption is that when you play that game, you are controlling Jane Eyre. You're not just watching a bunch of cutscenes where Jane Eyre does things beyond your control. Sometimes your character isn't a named individual, or their name is less evocative than the job they do inside the game. In these cases, the game is commonly named after the job. Some examples, Paperboy, Tomb Raider, Shinobi, Missile Command. The premise of these games, or the promise of these titles, is that by stepping into the feedback loop, you step into one of these thrilling jobs. You become a paperboy, you become a Sokoban or warehouse worker, you join the Fire Watch, you join the Moon Patrol, you are the Wing Commander. Some games have one really new thing that they're pushing on a technical level. This can be a platform, a piece of hardware or software, or a game mechanic. And in these cases, it's common for the game to just be named after the new thing. This is a weird kind of synecdoche where the technical innovation at the core of the game is the piece that is chosen to stand in for the entire game experience. And totally unrelated to any of the rules I just mentioned, but very important for a game that falls on the commerce side of the art-commerce dichotomy, is the fact that it's generally a good idea to take out a trademark on the name of your game. And since it's difficult to trademark single words, we see all of the naming tricks that get used to name laundry detergents and breakfast cereals and prescription drugs. Here, they're used to name computer games. So you can take two words that sound fun together. You can take two words and just smash them together into a portmanteau. You can take a English word and create a trademarkable variant of it. You can take an English word and just spell it wrong. Or you can go the prescription drugs route and come up with a game name that uses a lot of high scoring Scrabble tiles. So that's the strategy. These are all strategies that take you inside the feedback loop, except for the last one I mentioned, which is just about getting a trademark. There's a whole other strategy for naming, which is more aligned with the art side of the art-commerce divide. This was used by hackers in the earliest days of computer games. It was used heavily by shareware developers in the 1980s and 1990s. And for the past 10 years or so, it's been taken to new heights by indie developers. This strategy is to convey the experience of playing the game by setting the mood, by talking about the game as a whole, not just the core mechanism of the feedback loop. Now, unlike the feedback loop technique, there's nothing game specific about this strategy. This is the way movies are named. This is the way 21st century novels, as opposed to 19th century novels, are named. This means AAA developers use this strategy as well as indies. But unlike with movies and novels, the second person present tense rule still applies here. And some of the techniques I'm about to show you are pretty far out there. You'll only see them in art games or in freeware games. But this one's very common and very commonly used in big budget games, because it is the idea of naming a game basically the way you'd name a novel on the same subject matter. So in genre games in particular, it's very frequent or very common for genre games to have names that look like genre novels. Here's a bunch of fantasy games with interesting fantasy novel type titles going up to 1990. Some of these are really classy, like Oubliette, and some of them are a little less highbrow, like Dungeon Quest, the Date Stones of Rin. but they all kind of sound like fantasy novels. This happens for science fiction games and horror games as well. But one thing that I think is unique to fantasy is what you see on the right-hand side of this slide. A lot of well-known fantasy games are literally named as if they were stories or folk tales. The Bard's Tale, The Legend of Zelda, Elder Scrolls. They have literary imagery inside the very name of the game. This is a variant of one of the strategies that you use inside the feedback loop, or to convey what it's like inside the feedback loop. That strategy embeds you in the feedback loop by explaining your role in the game. Either you're a specific person like Ms. Pac-Man, or you have a specific job like Paperboy. This strategy works by describing something adjacent to the player character, the antagonist of the game, the weapon you use in the game, very often the setting of the game. Since the name of these games isn't directly about you, the player or the player character, this kind of name doesn't really tell you what the feedback loop feels like. It tells you a little bit about the world and sets a mood that way. These are really interesting. Sometimes the name of the game is your in-game job, as we saw with games like Paperboy, but the job is weird or it's off kilter in a way that doesn't actually explain what it's like to be inside the feedback loop playing the game. Everyone who was around in the 1980s for the arcade game Paperboy knew what a Paperboy did, but what does a Wumpus Hunter do? How do you slay a spire? In these cases, the job description only makes sense inside the game. So it looks like a title that's telling you what it's like inside the feedback loop. The only way to find out what that actually feels like is to play the game for yourself. What titles like these are actually doing is setting a mood, whether it's sort of cyberpunky as with Hypnospace Outlaw, whether it's a B-movie type thing as with Destroy All Humans, or whether it's kind of a in-your-face attitude as with Grand Theft Auto. And finally, you do occasionally see games whose titles create an offbeat or disturbing atmosphere by deliberately breaking the second-person present tense rule. This is really rare, and you really only see it in indie games, but there are a lot more of these than there used to be, and I just love these. Now, as you can see by the fact that people deliberately break what I said was the fundamental rule of game naming, these rules aren't set in stone. I came up with them by observation. Nobody makes you follow them. And there are a lot of indie games that subvert these rules for the sake of parody or humor. Three of my favorite examples are here. There's a silly freeware RPG called Barkley Shut Up and Jam Gaiden. It's parodying the name of a basketball game from 15 years earlier. Frog Fractions is a game with a deliberately misleading title, which fits in with its theme of hidden secrets. And Untitled Goose Game claims not to have a title at all because its theme is chaos and defiance of rules. But unrestricted creativity is a dangerous thing and it can easily backfire. Barkley Shut Up and Jam Gaiden is a good title for a silly RPG, but the original title, Barkley Shut Up and Jam, is a weird and kind of distressing name for a basketball game in 1993. Here's the cover for a game from 1997, Riven. This is the follow-up to a huge hit, also from 1993, Myst. Myst was a killer app for the new technology of the CD-ROM. A lot of people bought it. A lot of people loved it. So, of course, everyone was anxiously awaiting the sequel. Unfortunately, the developers of Riven didn't use any of the rules for naming sequels. I haven't covered these rules in this talk because they're not super exciting. You can probably imagine them. And you'd probably imagine something like Myst 2. And sure, that sounds cheesy and not super creative, but the rules exist for a reason. And when they made the decision to call this game Riven, they ended up having to add a subtitle, The Sequel to Myst, to the box. Just so that it would be clear that this was the actual sequel and not one of the many Myst knockoffs that were around at the time. So I'm gonna wind down by doing some close readings of a few game names that I think are really good. I love talking about this stuff, which is why I've left lots of time in this segment for a Q&A session. I'd love to talk with you about any game titles you think are unusual or interesting. So please, let's talk about that after the slides are done. So this one's pretty simple. Mule, M-U-L-E, turns an ordinary English word into an acronym. And as we all know, English words that get turned into acronyms signify science fiction. This happened all the time in the 1980s. Here's a movie poster for around the same time for comparison. Haven't seen this movie. It's called Daryl, D-A-R-Y-L. Has kind of a Last Starfighter vibe. By the way, Mule is also an example of a game named after an in-game tool. The Mule is a robot that you have do work for you in the game. Love this one. You thought SimCity was big. Well, check this out. We simmed the whole Earth. The enormous scale of this game reminds me of the epic science fiction of Olaf Stapledon. It seems appropriate that someone who could sim an entire Earth could also make stars. Got a lot to say about Space War. This is probably the 4th computer game ever created. And up to this point, all of the names are boring. Noughts and crosses, tennis for 2. And then Space War. I think this is the best name of a computer game from 1962 to probably 1980 at least. It's just incredible. Space War was written by MIT hackers. It was released the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was released at a time when computers were for the exclusive use of the military and big business. You see over on the left is the original hardware. If you play Space War on that thing, it looks like you're about to destroy the world for real. But it's got this cheeky name. It's named like a musical, like Oklahoma. And this has a fatalistic gallows humor to it, which I love. It reminds me of the 1964 film, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. In 2013, I had the good fortune of attending a Q&A session with Steve Russell, the primary author of Space War. I asked him about the exclamation mark in the title, and he said, once I got it working, I thought it deserved an exclamation point. This is a decision based entirely on artistic self-expression. So even if my Dr. Strangelove reading isn't what the creator of Space War had in mind, I think it's clear that Russell named his game the way he'd name a work of art. And I think the fact that Space War was freeware, it was not sold as a commercial product, reflects on that same fact. Now in 1971, the company that eventually became Atari turned Space War into an arcade game and sold it. But they didn't call the arcade game Space War. They used the lens of commerce to look at this game instead of the lens of art, and they gave the exact same name, they gave the exact same game the name Computer Space. Nice, boring name, the kind of name that games had up until the 1980s. So the fact that Space War was named in 1962 in the middle of a long, long stream of just bland, descriptive titles, to me, that's something really special. Here's 2 works of art that don't get compared very often, Leisure Suit Larry and Citizen Kane. Rhetorically, however, the titles of these 2 pieces are very similar. Both Leisure Suit Larry and Citizen Kane are named after their main characters, but this is not the way the main characters would describe themselves. There's a third person seen from outside quality to both of these. We're looking these guys up and down and maybe kind of laughing at them. On the left, Larry Laffer thinks he's a stud in his leisure suit, but we know he's a loser because it's 1987 and leisure suits went out with disco. On the right, we have Charlie Kane, who wants to be the most powerful man in the world, but from our privileged view as moviegoers, we see that he dies unhappy and unfulfilled, no different from anybody else, just another citizen. Both Leisure Suit Larry and Citizen Kane are sarcastic titles about people who end up failures, but they're not completely unsympathetic to their title characters. There's some kindness there. I'm going to close with Baba Is You, which is a little complicated, but I had to put it in because this might be the most clever game title I know of. Now, on one level, this title is completely conventional. It's like Ms. Pac-Man. It's just telling you which character you play in the game. You can see here, Bob is a little white rabbit thing on the bottom right, and you move Bob around with your controller. Bob is you, simple, right? And what I find interesting is that the words is and you explicitly place the title in the second person present tense. Most games leave this implicit. Here is you seems weird. It seems redundant and ungrammatical. You'd think this game should just be called Baba, unless something else is going on here. Something else is going on. Baba Is You is actually a tech demo title like Portal. The title is telling you about the game's signature innovation, which is a mechanic that I'm going to attempt to describe. Here's a screenshot of gameplay of Baba Is You. Baba Is You is a puzzle game based on tiles. You can sort of sense the tiles there. And you can see that there's 3 tiles that are literally the words Baba, is, and you, kind of near the top. Those are 3 literal objects inside the game world. The mechanical innovation of Baba Is You is that the sentences spelled out in the game world form the rules of the puzzle game. When this level starts, you control Baba, the little rabbit thing. But you can make Baba push these words around, like in Sokoban, and when you do that, you change the rules of the puzzle game. So for instance, if Baba were to go underneath the yellow word flag and push it upwards 3 spaces, it would nudge the purple Baba out of the way. And then suddenly, instead of spelling out Baba Is You, that sentence would spell out flag is you. At that moment, you stop controlling the little rabbit thing, and then you would start controlling the yellow flag to the right of the screen. Baba Is You becomes flag is you. You're controlling Baba, now you're controlling the flag. So the title Baba Is You is weird and ungrammatical in English, but in terms of the actual mechanics of the game, it's very grammatical. It basically tells you how the game is to be played. In so many video games, the second person conjugation of the verb to be is implicit in the title. You are Ms. Pac-Man, you are the wing commander. In this title, Baba Is You, the second person to be is made explicit. And that's not just done randomly, it's done because in this particular game, to be is a game mechanic, and what is you changes over time. Now, as I close this talk, it's reasonable to consider whether I'm overthinking this. Maybe there are no rules and I'm seeing patterns where there are none. Well, as evidence, let me present a quote from a 2015 interview with Eurogamer, where game designer Tim Schafer talks about the process of coming up with the name for his 1998 game, Grim Fandango. I've always loved Schafer's titles, how effectively they set the mood of the game. Brutal Legend, Full Throttle, Psychonauts, they all really evocative. And as you can see from this quote, Schafer tried out several titles on his way to Grim Fandango, always trying to set the mood. And when he finally came up with Grim Fandango, he felt a huge feeling of accomplishment to the point that he ran out and told somebody who didn't appreciate the great thing he just accomplished. I recognize this struggle. I put a lot of work as a writer into naming a novel or a short story. You have to convey all sorts of things. You have to convey a setting, a mood, maybe a character, a plot, some themes, which is okay if you have a whole novel to do those things, but in the title of the novel, you only have 2 or 3 words. And when you find the right 2 words, there's a rush of accomplishment. You solve the puzzle. Now here, digging into it a little bit, we can see that Tim Schafer started with a title for this game that's kind of silly, Deeds of the Dead. Sounds like a TV show episode to me. Then he goes through a noir phase with titles that sound like 1940s detective movies, The Last Siesta, Dirt Nap. And then finally, he comes up with a 2-word phrase that captures a mood of tragic grandeur by juxtaposing 2 words that kind of seem opposites, but are at a similar register. So congratulations, you solved the puzzle. And I have a appreciation for this because I know how really difficult it is to come up with a good title. But what I found is that it's a lot easier once you see how titles work in general. Hey, thanks for watching my talk. This is the end. Please stick around for the Q&A unless you're watching a recording, in which I simply hope you have a great day. If you're not watching a recording, you should know that I'll be reading 2 unpublished flash pieces at NASFiC later tonight. So I hope to see you there. I'm about to hop on the Discord and start the Q&A. Thanks again.